a political decision that can be made after and in light of consultation with the governed, dependent on these sort of governmental decisions being made. And this population also needs to be adequately informed. Decision makers also have to have the capacity and willingness to listen to those who are being governed. And these are just things we don't see, right? We see decisions made behind closed doors, or these sorts of fabricated public spaces, to Matt's point, right? Like there might be an offer to have some sort of insight, but it's produced in like conditions in which the average person can't get to. It's like in the middle of a work day, it's somewhere far away in a place that like requires you to have a car. And it's nonsense. It just ends up reproducing conditions that for most of this like nation state's history have just greatly affected those of us who are directly politically targeted, or can be turned into a political target further down the line. Yeah, so I guess those are just some thoughts, at least around how we've looked at secrecy, transparency, and transparency not as an end goal, but sort of as a first step at understanding something so complex. Do you have anything to add to that, Matt? I'm wondering if any of this like sort of rings true to the way ACPC has like approached this. You know, how do you see journalism in this sort of a space where there's so much secrecy and this greater need for transparency?
Yeah, I will say I've now published the documents to our Blue Sky, so you can go to atlpresscollective.com's Blue Sky and look at the records for yourself. If there are any questions that you have, throw them in the chat, and we'll hopefully have time to answer them at the end. I think they're also now on Lucy Parsons' Linktree, so should have access to everything you're looking for. So the role of journalism I see is as a form of organizing. You know, the founders of ACPC saw this massive issue that was lacking a resource, and that resource was information. It was lacking information about this training center, and so that's what they began providing, was information that was then used by organizers for protests, for eventually a referendum, for information to use at city council meetings. It became sort of an instrumental part of the struggle against the training center. And I think that's journalism at its best, is doing that. It is providing the information that people need to have an impact on the things that are happening in their lives. I think, Sam, do you have anything that you want to add to that, or take a look behind the scenes, talk about how the law side of things might have that same impact?
Yeah, happy to talk about the Open Records Act and the law side. But I think like hearing LA talk about things that are like undemocratic and decisions made behind the scenes, there were just so many examples that were like running through my mind of what has happened in Atlanta that fits within that sort of description. I imagine you have a few examples that might come to mind as well.
There are a few that we can get to, I think, directly when we're talking about the documents here at the end. The referendum, massive democratic effort that was stymied by the city in what I would say is an attempt to push forward policing, this self-replicating machine. In this process, we saw the largest public comment session. There was a city council meeting that I believe it's been over 2 years at this point, but I think it was 17 hours long. I got there, I left there at like 7 in the morning. And most of that was people speaking against the training center on the day that the city council voted to approve the funding for the training center. And so this whole process felt very anti-democratic. And we've now, spoiler, through these records, seen a little behind the scenes of how that anti-democratic or undemocratic process continued to play out.
Yeah, and so I think, attending city council meetings, board of commissioner meetings, also just like talking to neighbors and talking to people who have lived through their own personal experiences, like these things that, governments seem to be talking about in the abstract can really, provide so much insight into how the government is working, but also at the people's disposal is things like public records laws. In Georgia, we have the Open Records Act. Just about every state has its own, Open Records Act or Public Records Act, and at the federal level, there's FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, which can be a very powerful tool in accessing information. Here in Georgia, the Open Records Act, or the ORA, requires that records created by or received by government agencies are accessible to the public, and all you have to do is ask for them. And when I say government agencies, that includes, state agencies, like the Department of Driver Services. It applies to, the Fulton County Board of Commissioners, the City of Atlanta. It applies to, committees within these levels of government. It applies to public schools. It applies to, things like NPUs, neighborhood planning units here in Atlanta. And so whenever there's, a level of government deliberation, when there are decisions that are being made in the people's name, that people are supposed to have access to, those records, documenting them, under the Open Records Act. But also, it's not just about access after the fact. It's also about meaningful participation as deliberation is happening, so that it's not just, government officials making decisions without the input of, of the people. The people are also supposed to have, real-time contemporaneous access to those decisions as well. And so in Georgia, we have a law that codifies, that right of access, which is sort of a twin to the Open Records Act, and it's the Open Meetings Act, or the OMA. And so those two things together can really be a bulwark in, being a hammer, and a really meaningful tool in, in obtaining information. And we can talk about, ACPC is, now sort of does operate as a news outlet, and we use the word journalism, but at the end of the day, journalism is just, the packaging of raw information. And so, and also, I think it's important to note that the ORA, the Open Records Act, isn't just something that only belongs to journalists and people who, make it a profession to, write news articles, or, or policy people who make it their profession to, write policy pieces or whatever. The Open Records Act and that right of access belongs to every single person. And I think it's really important for people to know that, submitting a public records request, doesn't have to be this whole, ordeal. It doesn't have to, a request doesn't have to be made in any special format. It doesn't have to be done by a lawyer or someone, who has, any type of special knowledge. All that it takes is, sending an email to your local government official, or even just showing up in person, and asking, the county clerk or what have you, hey, I want a copy of, last week's meeting minutes. Can you, give those to me, please, right now?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a lot of us at LPL, the first time we ever filed a FOIA was at LPL. A lot of us came in, we had never really done it before. It was true for me, it's true for a lot of other folks within our collective. And I think that's important to state because it feels sometimes like there is this intimidating factor of using open records when in reality, and it's done, I think in some ways it's done in that way by design. Government is sort of a set of structures that look impenetrable but aren't really. But if you have ever looked for something using an internet search, you can submit an open records request.
Yeah, totally.
You can send an email out asking for information about what's happening within your neighborhood. You can FOIA or submit an open records request to really any public agency that's of interest to you, barring something. But yeah, so the barrier to entry is actually really low, and we see that the value that we get from it is pretty high.
Yeah.
At least in Chicago, we've started seeing that it's become a much more common tactic among organizing bodies. And I think we've been seeing it a lot more across the country, just broadly. Yeah.
Do you want to speak a little bit more specifically about some of the things that you've been able to do in Chicago?
For sure. Yeah, I mean, so I think there's a number of things. When LPL started in 2016, a series of FOIA, or Freedom of Information Act requests, started looking into the purchasing of portable cell phone towers. They're sometimes called Stingrays or MC catchers. And it ended up sort of turning into this larger project where, like, you know, you get some records back, and then some of those records might have had a very strange line item, and we're like, okay, what's that line item? So then we started asking about that. And at least during this time, I think it was 2016-ish, it ended up escalating to a point where we were able to see that the Chicago Police Department had a secret budget in which it was keeping resources acquired through civil asset forfeiture. And we were also able to see that, you know, no surprise to many of us, most of these resources were plundered from primarily Black communities on the south side of Chicago, and then used to do things like purchase routine police things like fixing their cars, et cetera, but also for purchasing or funding some surveillance equipment. So it was just, you know, that's something that started with a little bit of curiosity. Like, does this body have these devices? And it ended up turning into us finding out a lot more information than that. You know, in the past few years in Chicago, not just LPL, but a number of other collectives, organizers, activists, and so forth that we worked with, we used FOIA pretty heavily to understand the expansion and acceleration of the city's quote-unquote gunshot detection sort of surveillance system through the city's purchasing of devices from a company called ShotSpotter. They rebranded after we found some stuff out. And that information was useful because it clarified a number of things. It helped us understand more how the city was operating behind the scenes. It helped us understand what communication looked like between these various entities. It also gave us bits of information so we could see what many of us had already known and assumed, and it's that the vast majority of these devices were just deployed on racial lines. So we could sort of see that these kinds of, you know, like issues of just accelerated policing are decisions that are just being made behind closed doors using public funds, using like public sector agencies and so forth. And that access, you know, Sam, to your point, should have access to that information, and the deliberation process itself should have happened from the very beginning, because I don't think this would have been the outcome, you know. And yeah, I think another bit there that I want to get into, because it's relevant to this case that we were all a part of, is we also at LPL, within the context of Chicago, were interested in how the Chicago Police Department was working with private sector bodies like a University of Chicago nonprofit called the Crime Lab. In particular, at the time, we were very interested in understanding the research that was being produced with the Chicago Police Department by the Crime Lab. But we were denied access to those documents with the excuse being that the Crime Lab itself was not a public sector entity. So the argument that was given was like, so they shouldn't have to they shouldn't be subject to FOIA and turn over these records. However, we successfully argued in court following that what the Crime Lab was doing was it was fulfilling a governmental service. So it was essentially, you know, a subject of the Chicago Police Department within the public sector, and therefore the documents produced under that sort of contract should have been subject to FOIA. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I think, you know, it points to a few things. It points to this sort of a tendency of public bodies that should be transparent to the public and also, you know, have ideally a higher standard of accountability, often forego that by using private sector entities as a sort of shell to hide information or to hide assets and so forth. Yeah.
Speaking of which.
Yeah, speaking of which, yeah. So,
sounds familiar? I don't know.
Yeah, so something, we were talking about the Open Records Act and how it applies to government agencies, right? But as you've alluded to, it doesn't apply to private entities in the vast majority of cases, except when, as you mentioned, that private entity might be performing the work of government. And one such type of private entity that one might talk about might be police foundations.
Yeah.
What is a police foundation?
So police foundations are nonprofit organizations that are in effect boosters. They raise money for police departments. They might offer some other forms of support for police departments, but they are growing in number. And here in Atlanta, we have the largest police foundation in the entire country. It has more funding than the New York City Police Department, despite us having 15 million people in New York. We've got 500,000 people in the city of Atlanta. So vastly different sizes, but our police foundation is a top fundraiser with a top paid executive. It is also a leader in the field in terms of expanding police foundations. We have a little suburb in Atlanta called Sandy Springs, just outside of what we call the perimeter. And the Atlanta Police Foundation was instrumental in helping them get their Sandy Springs Police Foundation off the board. And they've had conversations with other police agencies around the country to encourage them to do police foundations. And then here in Georgia, we have this other aspect to it that our legislature a couple years ago passed a bill that allows people to donate directly to police foundations instead of paying taxes. Essentially, it is a direct write-off of your taxes. So, if you owe the state of Georgia $5,000, okay, you can pay such and such police foundation instead of paying the state. And so that actually was kind of an instrumental argument or one of the arguments in our lawsuit against the police foundation. But it shows, the priorities, at least here in Georgia, of supporting police instead of using those funds, I would say, to other more beneficial ends.
Right. How did this public records research begin? How did you get to know us?
Yeah, so shout out to Ed Vogel. Ed was our first contact at Lucy Parsons. Ironically, I think one of the first conversations we had with Ed was about ShotSpotter.
Yep, that's right.
So the city of Atlanta had a ShotSpotter trial, and I kind of wanted to go back to this anyway, so I'm going to toss it back to you.
Of course.
Open Records played an instrumental role in what happened with ShotSpotter. Can you explain that and explain what was happening with ShotSpotter that Open Records revealed?
Yeah, I mean, a number of things, right? I think there were a series of findings in Chicago that helped us understand more around how aggressively ShotSpotter was marketing their tool to municipal departments. I think we started finding more information around like lobbying tactics and so forth. We started understanding that they had I guess we were starting to understand how they were choosing markets to begin with. And I think, like Atlanta, Chicago is another major site of struggle for the fight against just accelerated policing, criminalization. It's a major abolitionist site of struggle. Because these sites are frequently used for, I would say experimental purposes. A lot of what gets developed within our cities gets either exported out to military or imported from military. It gets exported to other police departments. There's a lot of this tactical sharing, methodological sharing. which, like, quite frankly, it's anti-black, it's anti-indigenous, it's racist, and it's just a load of crap. And I think as we were doing a lot of this open records research, we had a better understanding of how these various bodies were communicating, but also how it started. It also just started revealing that it was much bigger than like our own sort of local fight, right? Like, and that's just, I think, a consistent point across our various campaigns, whether it's like surveillance, whether it's like, environmental, whether it's like oriented around like other kinds of unnecessary suffering. It's that like they're siloed on purpose, but really all these forms of suffering are unified. And I think when we started seeing a lot more of that, the local struggle became much more national, and we started, I think, talking to other organizers in other regions, and also using these tactics to see, well, what are the similarities that entities like ShotSpot or other, pick your favorite surveillance group, right? Like it could be Fusus, it could be like Block. How are all of these entities acting? What sort of rhetoric are they using to describe the protesters that they're trying to, discredit, delegitimize, and disarm? What other kinds of incentives do they have? Are they funding certain kinds of projects? That's like, convincing city council members to vote one way or another? Are they making it very difficult to have things like referendums? I think that it at least gave us more insight into these kinds of processes and the function of these companies, while also making more clear where the major sites of intervention might lie. I guess, yeah. I'm not sure if that's where you wanted me to go. Is there a direction? Yeah, I just jumped around.
You actually mentioning Fusus and Flock, I now realize I have to correct my own record. I said Atlanta Police Foundation paid for Flock contract. They paid for Fusus, which is a different police surveillance technology tool. So
there's so many.
There are so
Too many to keep track.
Yeah.
So my apologies for that. But Ed connected with us and talked a little bit about ShotSpotter, and then was saying, hey, I'm interested in doing some research on Cop City. Let me know what you need. Ed then introduced us to other researchers that y'all work with, kind of as a network. And then that relationship developed as just sort of a sharing, hey, did you see this piece of information? Hey, I'm going to send this open records request. Are you interested in it? And that sharing grew to, hey, have you tried to submit anything to the Atlanta Police Foundation?
Right.
And that conversation led to, okay, well, let's, what do we want to see from the Atlanta Police Foundation about this? So we came up with a list of things, and then we reached out to Sam to help us. We weren't certain we were going to get those documents to begin with, so we connected with you to begin the process. Can you walk us through how we got from point A to where we ended?
Yeah, so when Matt and Ed brought this idea of holding the Atlanta Police Foundation, APF, to account for, public transparency, I thought it was a great idea to, really try to hold their feet to the fire, specifically because, under the Georgia Open Records Act, I said earlier that generally only records in the possession of government agencies or government actors are accessible under the ORA. But under the version of the ORA at the time that the lawsuit was filed, which we can talk about later, under that version of the ORA, the right of access also extended to records in the possession of private individuals or private entities when those private individuals or entities were performing a service or function for or on behalf of a government agency. Right. And there are so many ways that APF, a private entity, works with the City of Atlanta and APD. From Operation Shield to I mean, you name it. There are so many different,
Do you want a
different,
list?
yeah.
I mean, Operation Shield, our youth diversion center, police housing.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's so many ways in which, the private entity interacts with the public entity. But the records related to Cop City really seemed like a slam dunk, honestly, in
Right.
terms of access, because there were so many concrete, measures that government agencies had taken that demonstrated, honestly, without question,
Right.
that building the Atlanta Public Safety Training Center, more accurately described as Cop City, was a service or function that the Atlanta Police Foundation was performing for or on behalf of the city of Atlanta.
Right.
The city of Atlanta had passed that resolution. Even the state government had issued, I forget exactly, I don't know if it was a resolution but they released like some kind of statement, sort of blessing, the construction of Cop City and saying that, this should go forward.
Right.
And, among other, sorts of examples that we cited in the complaint when we filed the lawsuit, we thought that the connection, the relationship between EPF, the private entity, and the city of Atlanta, the government agency, was just so cut and dry. But we didn't want to stop there. Like, we thought that, the arguments would be strongest for the records related to Cop City. But we also we also saw this as an opportunity to set a really important precedent for, police foundations in general. I mean, I think the construction and operation of Cop City is, a shining example, the sort of the crown jewel example, but like, I mean, APF performs more functions in the name of public safety in Atlanta than the Atlanta Police Department does.
Right.
And so we really wanted to, push for, those records related to FUSIS, related to FLOC, that might not necessarily, have the same sort of, resolution or blessing from the state government or the local government, but nevertheless involved a private entity performing a service for or on behalf of a government agency. So we filed the lawsuit in January of 2024. And yeah, felt really good about it. The complaint and the exhibits all together ended up being, almost, I think, 150 pages. We did our homework, we did our due diligence, and a few months later, got some pretty disappointing news from my then employer. So the UGA First Amendment Clinic was founded in 2020, and ever since the beginning of its founding, a core piece of the clinic's work in, advocating for First Amendment rights and, and not just advocating, but like directly representing
Right.
people in fighting for their First Amendment rights and, advocating for public access. A core part of it was, work under the Open Records Act and the Open Meetings Act. And from the clinic's founding in 2020 to the time that the lawsuit was filed in 2024, that was all, that was a huge part of the clinic's practice. But the lawsuit against APF was the first lawsuit that we had, that the clinic had technically filed. We had submitted, or the clinic had submitted, sent demand letters and, helped people, fight for access to public records, but had never filed a lawsuit up until that time. And didn't get, any pushback against our Open Records and Open Meetings Act work prior to the filing of this lawsuit. But about a month after the lawsuit against APF was filed, I received notice that the clinic would no longer be permitted to do any work under the Georgia Open Records Act or the Georgia Open Meetings Act anymore.
It's ridiculous.
And the reason given was that for a clinic operated by a state public university to be advocating for public access to public records was a conflict of interest. Again, despite the fact that we had been doing that work for
Right.
4 years.
It's suddenly a conflict of interest.
There are other clinics across the country. Are any of them also conflicted off doing open records work?
I can't speak on behalf of, I don't know the circumstances of all clinics across the country, so I don't want to, speculate. But I do know that, at least in California, there are clinics at public universities that operate out of law schools that have similar, public access media law practices, and who frequently sue local government, state government, private entities, you name it, asserting access under the California Public Records Act.
Wow.
So, just on a personal note, I was like distraught, honestly. I had left my job at the New York, it was only a 1-year fellowship and it was going to end anyway, but like I had,
Right.
I was fresh off of a 1-year fellowship in the New York Times legal department, more like in the New York war crimes legal department, excited to come back to Georgia, excited to, bring these like fresh public records FOIA chops to, to the people of Georgia. And especially wanted to use those, new skills or whatever to
Totally.
like aid the fight against, against Cop City and in defend the Atlanta Forest Movement. And and I was just like utterly distraught. And so what ended up, having to happen was, one, the clinic would no longer be allowed to do that type of work. And second, the lawsuit would have to be transferred we would have to substitute counsel in the lawsuit. And that broke my heart, but fortunately we had, some really, really excellent counsel step in and, took on the case pro bono, which it was, it was pro bono to begin with ACPC and Lucy Parsons Labs. That excellent attorney is Joy Ramsing. She is a firecracker. She is an excellent public records and public access attorney. And when it came to the trial, which happened in March of this year, Luke Andrews, also a fantastic public access attorney who has argued, who has won public records victories at the Georgia Supreme Court, also joined the trial team. And so we were destined.
Yeah.
We were destined for victory.
And shout out to if a journalist is watching this and you need help with open records, you should definitely contact Joy.
Yeah,
She was amazing.
yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so the trial. It was a 2-day trial. That was my first time seeing Dave Wilkinson in person. Seeing him get up on the stand. Yeah, you were there. Matt got up on the stand.
That was my first time on a witness stand, yes.
Yeah, and I examined Matt. The first time I've ever examined a witness at trial. We had a lot of practice rounds, and Matt did a very good job. What were some of the things? And so we called our own witnesses being Matt and Ed to talk about the requests.
Right.
And APF called their witnesses, or APF's lawyers called their own witnesses. What do you remember?
Right.
What do you remember from that trial, from those 2 riveting days?
Yeah, I'll put my hat of making the argument that they were trying to make, just so people are aware. The Atlanta Police Foundation didn't want to turn over these documents to the Atlanta Community Press Collective and Lucy Parsons Lab, though. They said that they feared for the safety of their contractors. if this information was given and then went out. And so the witnesses that they called to the stand were the project manager and then I believe, president of one of the big contracting companies. And they spoke at length about how they felt fear of the Stop Cop City movement, for property destruction or protests that were happening outside of their houses. And so they argued that for this reason, we don't want to give these documents to these folks. But the problem with that is at the same time that they were saying no to us, they were saying yes to other media outlets and giving some documents over to those outlets. And the Open Records Act is very clear. You hit on it earlier, that it doesn't matter if you're a journalist. It doesn't matter if you are somebody who is being imprisoned. It doesn't matter what you are, who you are. You have a right to records. And so our argument was that is, that is an unfortunate reality that those things happened, and for them, that is the unfortunate reality that they experienced it. But it doesn't matter when it comes to the records.
Right. Yeah. I like the judge's quote. Let the order also be clear that the identity of the requester does not determine whether records are public.
Exactly. Yeah.
And without that, the Open Records Act is then just who can we pick and choose to receive what we want, which is we were before we turned on the cameras, we were discussing kind of this idea of how secrecy works. Is you get to appoint who you tell things, and that is not transparency. Transparency is you don't get to pick and choose who learns the information.
For sure. And at least functionally what we see is that ability to retain some level of privacy is one that's frequently afforded to very powerful institutional entities, but is ripped away from just your average person or those of us who are, maybe most in the crosshairs of the sort of politicking and just malicious behavior. There is so much surveillance in Atlanta and in other cities across, in other regions just across this nation state. But the average person isn't given the privacy. They're given almost full transparency for the individual and full privacy for the institutional body.
Right.
Yeah.
So what's in the records?
What's in the records?
In the records. We won, by the way.
It
wasn't clear. We won.
This came to it.
Yeah.
We won,
Yeah.
as you heard in the judge's statement. The identity doesn't matter. The judge issued her decision in June, and then on July 1st, we received notice that the judge gave 30 days for them to turn over the records. So on day 30, we received notice that we had the records and have since been able to go through them. They're now public. If you haven't, if you're just tuning in, they are on the Lucy Parsons Lab link tree. They're also now on ACPC's Blue Sky, so feel free to click on the link to go straight to the records.
What did we ask for, real quick?
Yeah.
What did we ask for, and what was the fight? What was the
We
fight
asked
about?
for a lot of things. I asked for meeting minutes. So we had learned before this lawsuit, we had learned a lot about what was happening with Cop City through the meeting minutes of the Atlanta Police Foundation. So they are a nonprofit. Their board is required to meet and to take minutes. They had been, until ACPC, they had been sending meeting minutes to Chief Shearbaum. And so because of that, when we submitted a records request to the city of Atlanta, we captured those meeting minutes, and we were able to actually figure out a lot of things. And so they stopped sending those records to anyone in the city. So that's when we submitted, the request for the meeting minutes.
Right.
So that was the thing that was most outside of just the training center. In addition to that, we requested environmental reviews, line item budgets, communications between Dave Wilkinson, who is the executive director of the Atlanta Police Foundation, and I believe it was Chris Carr, yes, Attorney General Chris Carr, and communications about the referendum. There was this massive referendum effort to put the question of whether or not to overturn the lease of the land for Cop City on the ballot. And so there were a few other things. I think it was a total of 13 requests. I cannot remember them all, I'm sorry. But those were sort of the main ones, and those were the ones that we most directly have in the documents that are before us right now.
So what did we learn? Give us the highlights.
So what I will say is, had we had these documents when we asked for them, we could have reported a lot more. Because of the work of journalism, in the interim, we were able to obtain a lot of this information, or because of pressure from the city council to get some of this information. So we've learned things. But there were some clarifications. We learned, how much the two large contractors, Brent Scarborough and Brasford and Gorey, were paid. It was 10 million and 12 million, roughly, respectively. One of the things that I was surprised by when we got it is on page 115 is the security plan for the training center, for the construction period of the training center. So the security plan now is not what they're doing, but that gave us an actual number. Like we knew that there were a large number of police that were guarding the training center all of the time, 24/7. So that put a number to it. It's 40 officers at all points in time, which is
Wild.
pretty incomprehensible to me.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the number that they ultimately kept going, but we know it was a massive amount of numbers, and 40 was what they were shooting for. Some interesting things in there that I didn't know is that APD had installed flock cameras. Those are the license plate readers that I referenced earlier. They had installed flock cameras around the site, and they were concerned about this, and so they didn't tell the contractors or the Atlanta Police Foundation where these cameras were installed. It says in the security plan that APD will not release where those cameras are. And then we also, the Atlanta Police Foundation set up a security allowance for all of the contractors, and then in their insurance contract, there was a carve out where they were responsible for any act of, malicious?
They were required they were required to get insurance, obviously, but for acts of malicious mischief that occurred for which the damage done did not meet the deductible amount. APF was going to have to pay for that, which was, I just love that term.
Malicious mischief.
Like, what are you up to this weekend?
Just a little.
Just a little malicious mischief this afternoon. Yeah, you enjoy it? Yeah. Okay. So yeah.
One of the documents talked about the Atlanta Police Foundation being tipped off about the upcoming indictments. We kind of learned that through another open records request to the city, but that the meeting minutes that we got from this showed that it came directly to them through official sources. The most interesting documents to me are the last 6 or 7, I guess there's an attachment in there. And those are emails that are related to the referendum. Those emails are large, there are redactions in those, which in the judge's order, the judge mentioned that there were black boxes that she assumed had been put there for reasons unrelated to our lawsuit prior to turning them in. Now, you can scroll down, they're at the end of the records that we just put up. If you look at them, they appear to be entire emails that are redacted, and they're related largely to the referendum. So that's a big open question that we don't know the answer to. What are these now? What are these emails? But from the emails that we did get in those, one thing that we learned that we did not know was the level of lobbying that the Atlanta Police Foundation was doing against the referendum. You pulled some quotes earlier.
I did.
You write it down?
Yeah, I
please.
actually I took a screenshot. I was waiting for this. If you go on page 274 of the documents, I don't know what the PDF page is, but it should be 274. There is a header, impact of construction delays and a forced ballot initiative. And I'll just read it out loud. Halting construction would require stabilization of the site, which would cost $3,500 per acre or $297,000 for the 85-acre site. Maintaining site stabilization would cost approximately $28,000 per month. Notwithstanding the dubious legality of City Council passing a resolution that mandates a ballot initiative, the practical impact of such irresponsible action will range from adverse to catastrophic, almost certainly resulting in the loss of credibility for City Council and its members. The protests, loud and often violent, are notable for their persistence and hypocrisy. Routinely violent activists cloak themselves as oppressed, yet they seek to override their elected representatives who conceived, debated, and twice overwhelmingly approved the project in fully transparent public forums. APD and AFR chiefs have said that first responder morale and esprit de corps will be sorely, that's a phrase, will be sorely damaged by a deliberate city council resolution for a ballot referendum. And, it just goes on. Yeah.
Do you remember who wrote that?
I don't.
I believe, well, we don't know who wrote
What
that.
document?
That was the attachment.
Yeah.
So we don't know who the author of that was. It was in an email sent by Rob Baskin, who I believe is no longer at the Atlanta Police Foundation, but at the time was their vice president of communications, something along those lines. Communications, yeah. But yeah, the language there, to call a referendum, essentially to call a referendum undemocratic
Right.
is,
After all we've seen,
Yeah.
throughout this entire process trying to get just these documents,
yeah.
right?
Was there anything that y'all saw that I didn't hit?
I think you hit the highlights.
But there's a lot in there.
Yeah. There's a lot in there. People should, people should peruse at their leisure. Some just light reading.
I think again, we're at an hour here, but I think I want to, can we wrap up? You had mentioned what this can mean for police foundations elsewhere. And so this lawsuit was under the Georgia Open Records Act. So it may be more directly applicable to Georgia police foundations, but it can also serve other folks looking for transparency from their police foundation. Can you explain
What's generalizable?
Yeah.
Yeah, so like I said earlier, the idea that records in the possession of private entities can be subject to disclosure, like that's not a new principle.
Right.
This lawsuit did not set that precedent. That has been the rule that's been written in the statute. That's, a decision that the Georgia Court of Appeals and that the Georgia Supreme Court has, reiterated again and again in different contexts. But to our knowledge, and based on the commentary of some, scholars, we think this might be the first victory in defense of public access against a police foundation in the country, maybe. So
We get a little nervous using superlatives.
And so, regardless of whether it's the first or the second or whatever the case may be, given the scale of Cop City and just how far-reaching the movement has been in general, but also all of the ways in which APF's tentacles are, just like insidiously, squirming throughout the city of Atlanta. Like, we hope that this could set, a good precedent, or I want it to be a tool. I want it to be an organizing tool that people across the country will use, specifically in the context of police foundations. Now, of course, each requester is going to have to work within the bounds of, their state's public records law, because not all
Right.
public records laws are, created equal. But for those, states that do have a line about, public access to records in the possession of private entities that perform services or functions for or on behalf of government agencies.
We need that on a hat.
We have
just the entire thing.
Next
yep.
ACPC hat. Yeah, with a tombstone on it. Yeah, we hope that it'll be, yet another organizing tool in the toolbox.
Yeah.
But
Any
yeah.
of you in the chat can FOIA for your police foundation today and get things started.
Yeah.
Truly.
Yeah. And one last thing I do want to, I know that we're close to time, and I don't know if there are questions in the chat. I don't know if there's anyone watching.
There are.
Okay. I think, to situate, like, this lawsuit was filed a year and a half ago. And more, a lot has happened in the movement to stop custody since then. Among them, are the fact that this putrid,
Yeah.
facility has been constructed, which does not signal the end of this movement, certainly not, especially while the prosecutions of Stop Up City protesters continue, including that of Isla King, who's 21 now, was like 18 or 19 when they were indicted.
Was 18 when they were indicted.
Yeah.
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 20 or 21.
Yeah, a young person
Yes.
at the at the cusp of the of the beginning of their life, and is the first person who was supposed to have their speedy trial among the 61 people who were indicted with RICO. That was supposed to happen last Monday. It again did not go forward last Monday due to a mistrial, which occurred as a result of denial of the right of public access to the press and the public.
Yep.
By the work of the former judge presiding over the case, Judge Kimberly Adams, who improperly closed the courtroom to members of the public, which is not technically an Open Records Act issue. The subject of court transparency, is a separate and distinct, right, but they're all part of the same sort of constellation of public access. Yeah, what do folks have to say about that?
It sucks.
I mean, yeah. There's something I have been thinking about. We've gone far afield on the Isla King speedy trial thing. I've heard people say, there seems to be a fear of speedy trials. I will point out as well that the delay in this is part legal strategy on the part of the defense to file these appeals, right? Which is causing delays. Now the court closing down initially is the cause of the initial cause, but I don't want people walking away afraid of speedy trials because of what's happening with Isla King. That was so far afield. Sorry.
Thank you for your legal analysis.
I'm not a lawyer. Do not listen to me for legal advice. Yeah. Do we any last words before we close out?
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that I'd like folks to leave with is that, these sorts of tactics using FOIA, open records, they're just one of many in a diversity of tactics. They're generally pretty low lift. So although they're not going to directly lead to our own collective liberation, I think that they're reasonably easy enough to use and to start building off of. Too much is kept from us. Too much is just kept from all of us. And we've seen that at the very least, there are some cracks we can poke into, and this is just one way of doing that. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts, Sam?
Similar to what you just said about a diversity of tactics, I don't think that any one tactic is going to save the day, right? Certainly not the Open Records Act. That said, yeah, I mean, it can be a very powerful tool that I think sometimes people might underestimate, and I don't, something that I feel like I have neglected to call attention to is like, we've been talking about, how easy it is to submit an Open Records Act request, but like, that doesn't, firing off an email and, showing up to your city council, to your city clerk's office, demanding to see a record, is just the beginning.
Yeah.
Actually obtaining the records can involve, months and months of, back and forth emailing with public records officers, if they respond to you at all. They might say that these records don't exist, even though you know that they exist, but the public records officer is just taking issue with, how you phrase the request.
Right.
And then let's say they finally say that, okay, we do have your records, and if you want them, that'll be $5,000, please, because it took us, 50 hours to type in search terms, which, that's not real. It might also take filing a lawsuit.
It's true.
It can take, it can be like pulling teeth.
Totally.
And it can be really laborious. And, one of the biggest pieces of advice for people who are, interested in trying on this tactic is to be tenacious.
Yeah.
And to not give up and to have the stamina. And also to I know that organizers might lean, I don't want to generalize, but might sometimes lean more toward, an adversarial tone. My mentors and my guides in transparency work have always said it's easier to catch bees with honey than with vinegar. And, it might go against everything you believe in to, to think about forming, an alliance with, someone that you might view as an adversary, i.e. a county clerk. But that strategy of, communicating in a certain type of way, communicating in a way that is most likely to yield, production of records, is itself, a tactic that you can deploy.
Yeah. And,
So.
if it's not your thing, it's not your thing too.
Totally.
Or
yeah.
if it's the other thing too is to the point about, there are some aspects that can be difficult further down the line. You can reach out to groups like ours. You can reach out to LPL. You can reach out to ACPC, et cetera. Maybe, I don't know, I can speak on behalf of all you guys. But, I think it's also just important to reflect on this not being the sort of, what am I trying to say? It's not just an individual action. It's just not going to go that far if that's ever what it is. But we're in a collective struggle, so we have to help each other out and reach out for help when it's needed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So maybe we can see if you got any questions on Signal on your phones.
Okay,
really?
cool.
My
Maybe.
phone
That's wild.
is over there.
I'm just asking because people are texting me and just get
That's
people
so
at
funny.
home.
Yeah.
Nobody signal messaged me.
And no one
so
signal
That's
messaged
so.
you.
Oh no.
It's not me.
Okay.
No.
Let's see. I might have. Maybe a
I'll-
question.
If you do want to reach out to me on Signal, I won't answer it now, but 678, or I'm sorry, 404-666-3035 is my Signal
You're just
number.
giving out your number like that?
It's my Signal number. Yeah.
You're a reporter. Leak
Yeah.
That's so funny.
Please give my Signal number out to anyone you want.
I don't think
No.
I got
No.
the question. My question was, are you starting in half an hour from an hour ago?
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
Well,
thank you.
Thank
do you have any last? Did you say no? You can say no.
I mean, I think y'all covered it very well. The only thing I would add is what we do is not something outside of the realm of anyone being able to do. Journalism is not some hoity-toity thing where we have secret plans and access and ideas. Just try it. Get out and do it. If doing open records work seems like something that is interesting to you, just try it and keep trying it. And you might get a bunch of no's. You might, misformat an open records request, reach out to someone. There's a lot of documentation on the internet about filing open records requests, but ACPC has learned the value of open records even before doing any sort of interpretation on them, in just putting them out into the universe. So.
Yeah, and all of the records that we obtain through open records requests, we upload to our document cloud, which is accessible on atlpresscollective.com.
Any shout outs before we?
Any shout outs?
Yeah.
Shout out to Freddie for
Yes!
setting all of this up.
My
Shout out to
co-director.
Freddie. Shout out to
And
Nolan Huber, who helped with the camera setup.
Oh, shout out to Joy, yes.
Yeah.
Shout out to
absolutely.
Joy Ramsing. Shout out to Luke Andrews.
Yep.
Shout out to
Beautiful.
But seriously, our trial team, which also included
Oh.
Samantha Hamilton, was incredible.
thank you.
Love it, love it. Shout out LPL to
Yes.
my hosts who I think are watching. Shout out to
If we have
All the
missed somebody
friends.
that we should shout out to, I'm sorry, but
Yeah.
we love all
you.
of
We
you.
literally- I feel like
To the
some of the
Chicago
people who
homies.
some of the people who deserve a shout out would prefer not to be named. So
So that's exactly.
so you know who you are.
You know who you are, exactly. Mhm. Awesome.
All right.
Love you, Jack.
Thank you.
Yay! Drink water, it's hot out. Are we done?
Well, let me.
Are we still going?
I'm just gonna walk.
Yeah, I'm gonna walk away too.